Hi everyone. Welcome to another session with Ashish. This is a 7 session series that we are doing with Ashish, in which he'll be telling a lot about camera functions, exposure triangle, what all to consider before you purchase a camera, what all to consider before you purchase right lens for your camera, bit about post processing. So we have already covered 2 topics. This is the third one, in which we'll be talking about camera settings. Ashish, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining, and I think more people will be joining as we go ahead. And in last session, as I already explained by Pankaj, we talked about exposure triangle, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So today we'll be looking at how to use these different parameters in camera in practical situations, and how to change the camera settings and what settings are available in a DSLR camera. So I'll get right ahead into the content for today. I will start with this question that most of us have when we start our journey in photography, whether to shoot RAW or JPEG, and what is the better format to shoot. So I will go ahead with specifying what is the advantage of shooting RAW. RAW is basically the straight output from the camera sensor. So it's the best output that your camera can capture, and the biggest advantage with it is that you have a lot of room for post-processing. You can recover a lot of shadow details, you can recover a lot of lost highlight details. So it gives you a wide range to process your image after you've already taken the image, while JPEG is a compressed format. So JPEG image is lighter in size, 8 megabytes or 10 megabytes. It's lighter in size, but that means a lot of content is lost, because you can see just by the size reduction that a lot of content is lost. A RAW image from a 24 megapixel camera weighs somewhere around 30 megabytes to 35 megabytes. Yeah. And a JPEG image will be around 8 megabytes. So you can see the loss of data that's there in the compression process. So of course, JPEG is lighter in size and easy to store, but if you are looking forward to retain the best quality that is produced by your camera, I will suggest you should choose to shoot in RAW. All right, so next topic for today's session is shooting modes. Most of you guys who have a camera, it has a dial on top and it has different modes in it. So we'll be looking at what do those different modes mean and how to use them in an effective way. So there are 3 modes, and let me just show you what does the dial look like in my camera. In your camera, although it may be different, this is the dial that I'm talking about, which has this A mode, M mode, S mode, and various other things. So these are the modes that I'll be talking about in this section of today's session. A mode, which is represented by A, is called aperture priority mode. And what it means that you will be telling the camera that what is your preferred aperture to shoot the picture. All right, so you decide what is the aperture, and your camera selects a suitable shutter speed to maintain the optimum exposure for that particular scene.
So that means it's not completely manual, it's part you are taking control and part you are leaving to the camera.
Exactly. So it definitely expedites the process of changing the settings of your camera, because there's only one control that you are telling the camera. You're telling what aperture to shoot the image in. And if you're choosing aperture priority mode, it also means that your primary concern is depth of field, because that's what aperture controls. So if you want to shoot with a shallow depth of field, then you will tell the camera that I want to shoot at a smaller f numbers. But if you want a larger depth of field, you'll tell your camera to shoot at larger f numbers. And the camera will choose a shutter speed accordingly. The one thing that we need to be careful while using aperture priority mode is to be sure that the shutter speed is not reduced so much that the motion is blurry, your pictures become blurry. Because camera doesn't know that 1/10 seconds is too slow. It will, to get the appropriate exposure, it will just reduce the shutter speed value. So that is something that you need to be mindful of, especially if you're shooting at larger f numbers, which means smaller apertures. That will require shutter speed to be quite low in order to let more light get into the camera. And if your subject can move, it's in motion, then that's not a good situation. So it's really good for outdoor portraits, and sometimes if you're doing some sort of photojournalism shots or some sort of street portraits, so this mode is really good for that kind of situation. The next mode that is there is shutter priority. It's usually represented by SV letter or just letter S. And in this mode, just like in the previous mode, you tell the camera what aperture to shoot at. In this particular mode, you tell the camera at what shutter speed you want to shoot the subject. So let's say there is a fast moving subject, and you know to freeze that subject's motion, you need to shoot it at 1/250 seconds or faster. So you tell the camera to shoot at a particular shutter speed, and to maintain the optimal exposure, camera will automatically select a suitable aperture.
Right.
Now, in both of these modes, you're telling camera one of the mode and another, one of the parameter, and another parameter is selected by the camera. There's one parameter that is left, which is ISO, and in all the three modes, the third mode we have not gotten into yet, but in all the three modes, you can tell your camera to have auto ISO. What auto ISO will mean, that you can tell the camera to vary the ISO depending on the lighting situation within a specified range. So let's say your camera can, you know that your camera can produce acceptable images up to 6400 ISO or maybe 12,000 ISO. Then you tell your camera to keep the ISO less than 12,000 or less than 6400, and in that way your camera will vary ISO within the acceptable range if in case the shutter speed is supposed to go too low. So instead of reducing the shutter speed in aperture priority mode, your camera will change the ISO. Or if you're in aperture priority shutter priority mode, instead of changing aperture too much, your camera will change the ISO within the acceptable range. So that is one slight bit of automation that you can do in all of these three modes, although these are called manual or semi-manual modes. Coming to manual mode, in this mode you take control of all 2 or 3 of the parameters. So you'll have to manually tell the camera what aperture you want to shoot at, you'll have to manually tell the camera what shutter speed you want to shoot at, and you'll have to specify what ISO you want to shoot at. Even in this mode, you can use auto ISO feature, and you can tell the camera this is my ISO range, and the camera can vary the range within that specified limit. Now, after we get, there are some other modes which are not very usually used, and so I'm not going to discuss those. If you want more those, there's rarely any chance when you have to use those modes. These 3 modes, and in my experience, I've never used any other modes than these 3 modes. These 3 modes is what suffice my purpose, all kinds of shooting environments. Yeah. So we'll not get into other modes, which is P mode, which is programmable mode. We will not discuss that. And then there are special effects, which are presets that your camera comes with. Those are also never used. If you understand how exposure triangle works, then you can use all those presets with your own settings, with a touch of your own settings. Next we'll get into is dry modes. Dry mode means it's how your camera take pictures. It's like if you press the shutter button once, it will take only 1 picture, or if you press the shutter button and keep it pressed, it will continuously keep shooting. So that is called dry modes. So there's one mode which is called single shot, and it's most of the camera companies represented by S, the single shot. So if you select this mode, when you press the shutter button once, only 1 image will be shot. And to click the next image, you'll have to release the shutter button and then press it again.
That's it.
So that's called single shot mode. And in this, there's a feature in the camera. It's called autofocus priority. So in this autofocus, single shot priority should be set to focus. What it means is that your camera, when you press the shutter button, if it's not in focus, it will not trigger the shutter. The shutter will not be clicked, or the camera will not click. So the AFS priority is set to focus. The other option is AFS priority to be set to shoot, which is called release. So if you select that option, and when you press the shutter button, it will click irrespective of whether the subject is in focus or not. So this is something that usually is left out and people are not aware of this. The next dry mode comes as continuous. What continuous means, it means that as long as you keep the shutter button pressed, your camera will continue to shoot until its buffer is full up. It's completely full. So it will keep shooting till that point arrives. Most cameras are able to shoot up to 30 or 20 frames before they slow down. They will still continue to shoot, but they will slow down. So if it was 6 frames per second, it will be like 2 frames per second or 3 frames per second after the buffer fills up, because the camera needs some time to load that buffer memory into your SD card of the camera. In this case, the AFC priority mode has to be set on release. So why is that? In continuous mode, you are depending on your autofocus, which is also set in continuous mode. So it is continuously focusing, but your shutter will not stop because it is not in focus. It will continue to shoot as maximum rate possible, irrespective of whether the focus has been locked or not. But at the same time, camera's autofocus system will keep trying to focus, but it will not slow down your dry mode. So there is something to remember. So in this mode, AFC priority mode has to be set in release. Another thing that limits the speed of your camera when shooting in continuous mode is the card speed. So you have to select a memory card which has sufficient read and write speed. SanDisk has an Extreme Pro cards, which is 95 Mbps, so 95 megabytes per second it can read and write. So that is really good card, and it's sufficient for most 24 to 35 megapixel cameras. But if you're going higher than that, like D850 or 5D Mark IV or Sony A7R3 AR4, where A7R3 or A7R4 kind of cameras, where the megapixels has 45 megapixels, 60 megapixels, 50 megapixels, you need to get a 250 Mbps card. So a much higher capacity card, so that your speed, writing speed, is not limited by your card, memory card. So that's something to remember.
Optimize, take maximum advantage of your high-end camera. Otherwise, that would be limited to the SD card capacity. Yeah,
exactly. It will work as a bottleneck. So you don't want your card to be bottleneck when you spend thousands of dollars in your camera equipment. So after the continuous mode, there's a self-timer mode, and self-timer mode, it's very evident what it is. You set a time, and when you press the shutter, camera takes the picture after a certain time. But two very important things are that in some of the camera models, you can specify number of shots that will be clicked after you press the shutter button and you wait for camera to take a picture. So you can specify to your camera to take 3 shots after you press the shutter once. So it will wait for the time, let's say 10 seconds, and after 10 seconds it will take 3 individual pictures. And the second thing you can specify is interval. At what interval does the camera has to take those 3 pictures? So if we specify 2 seconds, 2 seconds of interval and 10 seconds of timer, so your camera will start taking pictures after 10 seconds of pressing the button, and then it will wait for 2 seconds after every consequent picture up to 3 pictures or whatever is the number that you specified to the camera. So that is something.
So this is the time-lapse mode that you're talking about? This is time-lapse mode that you're talking about?
No, time-lapse mode is completely different. It's a different mode in the camera, but this will be under self-timer mode. So when there's dry mode, if you go inside the menu in the self-timer, there will be 3 options, and those options you can exercise. Time-lapse is completely different. You set the camera and you ask the camera to take hundreds of shots. So that's really different. This is more like if you're taking a group picture, and usually one picture, let's say some of the eyes are closed, some people close their eyes. So you take 3 or 5 pictures so that definitely you get one picture in which everybody's eyes are open if you're lucky. Or if you're really unlucky, then all the 5 or 6 pictures somebody will have their eyes closed. So that's really a good option to know about. I personally did not know about this interval and specified number option for initial 5 years of my shooting experience, and I came to know after already shooting for 5 years. So I thought it's important to mention in this session because many people don't realize that there is that option.
Yeah, absolutely.
By default, your camera will come with one exposure. So if you are in self-timer mode, you press the button, it will only take one picture. So that's a default option. After this, there are 3 modes which are present in different cameras with different brand name, different names in different brand names. So one is exposure delay mode, another is quiet shutter mode, and yet another is mirror up mode. So these are 3 different names, but they essentially do the same thing with slight variation. What exposure delay mode is, before that, I think you're aware that in DSLR camera there's a mirror assembly, and that mirror helps you to see what is coming in the scene coming through the lens, and shows you in the viewfinder whatever is in front of the camera. So the mirror assembly has to flip up. A mirror assembly is just in front of the sensor. So before the camera takes the picture, the mirror assembly has to flip up so that it can record the picture, and it flips back. So when it flips up and it flips back, it creates vibrations. So what these modes tend to do is to, when the mirror assembly is flipped up, it keeps it there before the camera takes a picture. So it waits for a few seconds, and that's the exposure delay mode. So if you ask EDM, exposure delay mode is commonly known as EDM. I'll be saying that, it's easier to say. So if you ask EDM to wait for 3 seconds, then it will raise, when you press the shutter button, the mirror will be locked up. It will wait for 3 seconds and then take the picture so that the vibrations are died out. It doesn't spoil your picture. The quiet shutter mode and mirror up will do the same things but in slightly different manner, and I'll not get into the details how they differ from each other, but just for the sake of your knowledge, know that all 3 of those do the similar thing. They reduce the shake caused by the mirror assembly flipping up and flipping down. There's another new technology that has come up in some of the mirrorless cameras, and it's called electronic front shutter. That is because you know that the mirrorless cameras don't have a mirror assembly, so that problem is not there. Yeah. Electronic front shutter, electronic curtain solves other problems. But what is relevant to this section is some of the DSLRs like D850 from Nikon and Z7 from Nikon. They have electronic front curtain in their DSLRs which have the mirror assembly. So what it does, it lets the mirror come up and also the shutter open up. But the sensor doesn't start recording the image. It starts recording the image electronically. So it's triggered electronically, and then it starts recording the image, and then the mechanical shutter closes, and then the mirror assembly goes down. So that is called EFC. It's electronic front curtain shutter, EFCS. That's what it's called. So it's in some of the recent cameras, and it's really good way to reduce that shake. And if some of you have wondered that why your landscape pictures are not sharp, this may be one of the reasons, because when your mirror flips up, it vibrates the camera, and that's why your landscape images are not as sharp as some of the images that you see online. So this may be one of the reasons. Right.
Does that mean that these mirrorless cameras are better in terms of creating a sharper image because of not creating any kind of vibration?
Just in this respect, yes, we can say that, but as we mentioned, there are ways to get around it. You can lock the mirror up, and you can use the quiet shutter mode or exposure delay mode to get around that problem. So those people who really like shooting through the prism real viewfinder, where the view is real and live, it doesn't look kind of LCD like. So some people are more comfortable shooting with that. So I won't recommend switching to mirrorless just because of this reason, because DSLRs are well capable of handling this vibration issue. And most of the portraits or normal shooting situation, it doesn't cause much problem. It doesn't cause any noticeable lack of sharpness. It's only when you are using longer shutter speed and slightly like less than 1/60 seconds or in that region, or then if you're shooting really long shutter speeds in case of landscapes. So there it matters more, and there are ways to do the roundabout. If you really like DSLR with the mirror assembly, then it's not a strong enough reason to switch to mirrorless. But there are obviously reasons that may make you switch to mirrorless, which we will be looking at in our equipment selection session that we'll have later on. So let's get to the next topic in today's session, which is AF modes, this auto-focusing modes. Your camera is able to auto-focus, and we all use autofocus and we're all aware about it, but it has some different modes, and there are different things that you can do with it to help you shoot more effectively in different kind of environments. There's first mode, there are two main modes, which is AFS and AFC. AFS is, in Canon, it's called single servo, or a single shot, I think, or single focus, something like that it's called. And it will be similar, it will be quite self-explanatory in different camera brands. So what it means that when you press the shutter button or like press the focus button, it will lock onto the target and then it will keep it locked until you press the shutter or take the picture. So that was AFS means. It will focus once and keep it locked until you press the shutter or release the focusing button, that it will release the focus. The benefit of this mode is you can recompose. So you can point the camera to a certain subject, lock it in focus and then recompose. The focus will stay locked at that point. Even if that subject moves in a different part of the frame, the focus will stay locked. So that's one of the biggest advantages of using the single focus mode. Okay. Now, the next mode is AFC, which is continuous, and it's called continuous servo mode, or in Canon it's known by servo mode, some sort of servo mode, and Nikon it's known by autofocus continuous mode. And other brands may have different names for it, but essentially it will do the same thing. What it does, that when you point the camera towards a subject, it continuously keeps focusing on the subject. If the subject moves a little bit here and there, or if you move the camera to a different subject, then the autofocus will automatically lock on while you have the focusing pressed all the time. You have engaged the autofocus of the camera, and the camera will continue to focus on the subject which is slightly moving, changing its position, or you move the whole camera to a different subject. So autofocus will automatically lock on to the new position of the subject or the new subject itself. That's the autofocus continuous mode. Now, in the second mode that is related to autofocus modes is autofocus area mode. Most of you must be aware that the cameras have certain number of focus points. Some cameras have 9 focus points, some cameras have 51 focus points, some camera these days have 400 focus points, so a lot of focus points. Now, in single AFS, which means autofocus will focus once and keep it locked, that mode, you can select which focus point you want to use to lock focus onto the subject. And if you're using the AFS, which is single focus mode, then I'll recommend you to use the selectively center focusing point and don't change it, because you can lock focus onto that and then recompose. So there's no point changing the focusing point in case of AF single, autofocus single mode. If you're using the autofocus continuous mode, then there are several options. One is in which it will select single point, and let's say if you're in AF continuous, AFC mode, and you selected one single point. You pointed the camera to the subject and you try to focus on it. Now it will not lock focus because the subject can move, so it will keep trying to focus on the new location of the subject. But the focus will be only on that point. If the subject moves away from that point, the camera will not focus by itself. it will focus whatever is at that point in front of the camera. The point will not change with the subject. All right?
Right.
So this is if you're using AFC mode and you have selected the single focusing point. This is what the behavior of the autofocusing will be. Then there's option of choosing cluster of the points. So you can choose a cluster of 9 points, 21 points, or 51 points. So there will be clusters made. So if there's a cluster, instead of 1 point, there's a cluster of 21 points now. So if your subject moves within those 21 point zone, within that zone, that the camera will keep focusing on the subject that you first initially focused. So your camera will keep focusing on the subject. But if that subject moves outside the cluster of that 21 points, your camera will focus on whatever lies in front of those 21 points. It will not go and try to track the subject. So I hope that makes sense. Then there's a mode which is called 3D mode. In 3D mode, so in Nikon calls it 3D mode. I think Canon may have their different technology, terminology, maybe matrix mode or something else. Evaluative, sorry, yeah, I remember. Canon calls it evaluative mode, where it tries to guess where the subject is going. So the selected point will change as the subject is moving across the frame. So the focus will try to follow as the subject moves in the frame. So that's the difference between these different autofocus area modes that you should choose. And this is pretty much it about the autofocusing. Is there anything you want to add, Pankaj, to the autofocusing? Any question?
No. Questions we'll take after the session.
Okay. So very close to autofocusing is metering. So in the previous section, like yesterday's session, we looked at how your camera in automatic mode tries to take the optimum exposure. It's not too bright, it's not too dark, and it just tries to click the optimum exposure. And to be able to do that, your camera is equipped with a sensor to measure how much light is in the surrounding, how much light is there in front of your camera. And your camera can measure that light. And that measuring is called metering. That measuring of light that is entering into your camera, that is present in the surrounding, is called metering. Now to maintain optimum exposure, camera needs to know how much light is present in the surrounding. And for that reason, it has sensors built into the camera. The metering is represented by a scale, which is usually you can view it inside the viewfinder, or you can look at it in the screen that is present in the camera, the back screen of the camera. It usually looks like a scale, and on one side there's positive, on one side there's negative, and in the middle there's neutral, it says 0. So that 0 point represents the optimum exposure. And on the plus side, it represents the overexposure. On the minus side, it represents underexposure. So camera measures the light and it tells you what the situation is, whether it's at present conditions, present settings of the camera for ISO, aperture and shutter speed, whether the image will be overexposed or it will be underexposed or it's correct. It only indicates you, but it doesn't change the settings by itself if you are in the manual mode. All right, so this is a really important concept to grab. Please understand this. Metering represents or indicates to you based on the light in the surrounding. If at present settings of ISO, aperture and shutter speed, if your image will be overexposed or underexposed. If you are in manual mode, then you use it as a guiding principle to change your settings to bring the metering at the center, and then you know that it is optimum exposure. Okay? If you're using any of the aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode, then based on the measurements that your camera has made and based on the algorithms that are already built into the camera, it decides what is the optimum exposure, and accordingly it will select the other parameter. So if you are in the shutter priority mode, based on those computations, it will select an aperture. If you're in aperture priority mode, then based on those algorithms, it will compute a suitable shutter speed and vice versa. So camera has one understanding of optimum exposure. So during the daylight, broad daylight, it will try to make a well lit, well exposed picture. But if you try to use the same metering at night or the evening shot, it will again try to expose the overall shot. So it will try to give the equal exposure what it did the daytime. So that's where you as a photographer, your acumen, your understanding, your skills come into the play, because you as a human being understand evenings don't look like broad daylight. So you will expose the shutter, you will expose the camera accordingly. You will use the balanced shutter speed and aperture in order to make the image look like an evening shot and not like an afternoon shot.
And then
So
it would actually
if
depend upon individual preferences also as to what
exactly,
amount of light you want in the pixel. So even if the metering is suggesting that the image is underexposed, but if
right.
you want to take that kind of a shot, you can still go ahead. But that's the indication from the camera side that okay, there is probably something wrong with this image that you have framed. Probably you would want to correct it. But then, yeah,
Exactly.
it's individual preferences also.
Yes, so in manual mode, it will not affect your settings, because manual mode, whatever aperture, ISO and shutter speed you tell the camera, it will shoot irrespective
Yeah,
of the fact whether it is optimum exposure or not. Camera will not interfere. But if you're in aperture priority or shutter priority mode, then you will have to depend on what camera thinks is optimum exposure.
right, right.
There's a way to get around it, and that is called exposure compensation. So then you basically shift that neutral. So wherever that zero is, zero was, on them in the middle there's a zero. On the one side there's positive, and on the other side it's negative. So underexposed, overexposed, and optimum exposure. So by using exposure compensation, you can tell your camera to consider 0 at -3 or consider
Right.
0 as +3, and so that will shift the neutral point in the understanding of the camera. So now camera will think that neutral is at +3 or at -3 or -2 or +2, whatever exposure compensation you tell the camera to do. So that will take care of it even in case of aperture priority and shutter priority. Both those modes, you can still have that control of creativity. You can make the evening shot look like evening shot, or you can make a different lighting condition as how you want to represent them.
That's a very important concept when you are shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority mode, because lot of times we see that when we try to reduce the shutter speed, there are parameters that change automatically that we don't want to, just because camera is trying to optimize the light. So
Yes.
this comes in very handy when you want to actually tell the camera, okay, I'm changing this, but you change within this limit. I mean, this is what you need to look for. You're kind of guiding
Exactly.
camera also without going to absolute manual.
Yes, exactly. And so one of the greatest advantage that you will find to this ability to do the exposure compensation, when you have to shoot either perfect white subject or perfect black subject, because to camera, black and white are the same color. It doesn't distinguish between black and white. They both are 18% gray. So if you
Okay.
point your camera to a perfect black object and ask it to optimize, do the neutral exposure, and you make the settings to the neutral exposure, it will take 18% gray image. And then if you point that camera to a perfectly white image, and then you adjust the settings for optimal exposure, it will again take the exactly same 18% gray image. So your camera doesn't know any difference between white and black. To the camera, it's the same color, it's the same tone, basically.
Okay.
So if you're shooting snow-capped mountains, you'll have to tell camera, no, it is not 18% gray. You have to add 18% on the exposure side in order to make it look perfectly white. The same will go if you have to shoot perfectly black object. In order to shoot it black, you'll have to go 18% on the negative side, so that you have to tell the camera it's not 18% gray, it's 18% towards the negative side, and that's the exact thing that I want to shoot. So you have to tell the camera when it's perfect black subject or perfect white subject, that it's not 18% gray. So that's where this comes in really handy. And for metering, there are 3 different modes in the cameras. One is spot metering. What spot metering does, it basically goes along with the focusing point that you have selected. So it will take the measurement of light from the point that of the focus that you have selected.
Yeah.
If you selected the center point, then it will only measure light from that center point in the frame. But if you have selected one of the exterior point, it will only measure light from that particular point. This is called spot metering. It's used when your subject is quite small in comparison to rest of the frame, and you want to expose the subject perfectly, and you don't care much about if the surrounding get overexposed or underexposed, but you want the perfect exposure on the subject. So in those cases, you use the spot metering. After that comes the center weighted metering. In center weighted metering, it's slightly different from the spot metering in the sense that it is linked with the center of the frame. It doesn't matter which focusing point you have selected, but center weighted metering will always take measurements of the light from middle of the frame. If this is your frame, at the center only it will take the measurement. So that's how center weighted metering works. And then comes the matrix metering, which takes into account the whole frame. All of your frame will be evaluated, how is the lighting condition, and accordingly camera will decide what is the optimum settings for exposure, or where in the metering scale exposure will lie. So this is something that is that you need to practice and practice it really well, and master focusing modes and metering modes. These 2 are very important if you want to seriously get into photography. Now the next topic in today's session is white balance. Now as we talked in the beginning, you must remember we talked whether to shoot RAW or JPEG. If you're shooting JPEG, then white balance comes into the picture, but if you're shooting RAW, then in camera white balance doesn't matter. It will not be applied on the picture if you're shooting RAW. It's only for JPEGs. But it's important to understand the concept of white balance, because it will affect the results that comes out of your photography, comes out of your post-production. So white balance has to do with the ambient light and how that light affects the colors in your image to be recorded by the camera. So if there's a colored light, if there's a hue to the light, let's say blue light or green light or the red light in the surrounding, then human eyes don't get affected. We still see the object same color. Because our brain knows this is a familiar object, it's red in color, it's red in color, and it will remain red in color irrespective of what kind of lighting is. But your camera is not smart. Your camera will capture that object under the influence of red lighting, so it will not capture its original color.
Right.
Now the white balance, or the color of the light is represented, when it comes to white balance, the color of the light is represented by temperature. It's represented in Kelvin. So either the light is warm or the light is cool. So if the light is more yellowish, which is around golden hours, around the sunset and sunrise, the light is more yellowish, and it's lower in temperature. So the temperature is around 1700 Kelvin, so 1700 Kelvin. That's more around the warmer side. I know it doesn't make intuitive sense because the lower temperature is related with the warmer light. Okay. As we go toward the cooler light, which is more to broad daylight, or if there can be object or there can be a bluer light, that is considered high temperatures. It's around 12,000 Kelvin. That's the bluish light. Now some of the cameras allow you to change the white balance based on the Kelvin values. You can tell your camera that this is the Kelvin value that is in the ambient light, and it will adjust for the colors based on that value that you entered. Or alternatively, you can tell the camera to use custom white balance by taking the picture of a gray car in the ambient lighting and then tell your camera to adjust white balance from that picture and be able to apply white balance. White balance is nothing, is basically you are telling the camera what actually white looks like in this particular lighting. So whatever is the ambient lighting, what white looks like in that lighting, you tell the camera, and then camera adjusts for all the other colors because it just shifts the whole spectrum. And that's basically white balance. If you're shooting raw, your camera will shoot the best output, best imaging that your sensor can do. And in post-production, you can decide what is the white balance that accurately represents the colors that were there in the scene. There's another method to correct white balance. It will be again covered in the post-production session. If there's a white part in your picture, in your frame, if there's a white part, then in post-production you can tell the software that this particular area is white, and then it will adjust for all the other colors. But you need to know that this object or this thing was actually white when I shot the image in the scene.
Yeah,
exactly. So if you remember that, then you tell the software that this was actually white, then software will adjust for rest of the colors. This will be covering in post-production again. Now, the last topic, I think this is the second last topic, is flash sync. And flash sync is not really the camera setting, but still some cameras have an inbuilt flash, so it's somewhat relevant. There one way to sync the flash, it's called TTL. TTL means through the lens. So what it means, your flash will fire at the intensity which is suitable to add onto the ambient light. So if there's already some light available, your flash will fire with intensity that is just enough to fill in the gap, right? So that's TTL. It throws just sufficient light to light your scene. It's kind of a smarter version of flash. Another thing that you need to know, that your flash can sync only up to 1/200 of the shutter speed. So if you're using normal flashes, if you're using speed light, if you're using inbuilt flash of the camera, it can sync only up to 1/200 of the shutter. If your shutter speed is faster than this, then you will see the shutter curtain in the image. It will be captured because your shutter is going faster than the sync speed of the flash, sync speed with the flash. Sync speed basically means when your shutter opens and closes, that's when the flash will fire.
Right.
Okay. So that depends on the ability of syncing, and presently most of the common flashes can sync up to 1/200, 1/250 seconds. There are fast sync shutter speeds flashes are available in the market, and they're quite expensive. Photo is one such brand, and I think Godox is another brand that is out with some really fast sync flashes that can go up to 1/8000 seconds. So that can sync really fast, but the output will be limited. Now, one very important technique that I want to talk about in flash syncing session is rear curtain sync. So by default, your flash is synced to the front curtain. I'll tell you what front curtain and rear curtain is. So when let's say you are doing an exposure of 5 seconds, your shutter is closed as default, and you press the shutter button, your shutter opens and start recording the image. So this process of opening is known as front curtain. And after 5 seconds, when the camera is finished with recording the image, the shutter closes. And when shutter closes, it's called the rear curtain. Okay? So by default, your flash is programmed to sync with the front curtain. As soon as the shot starts, your flash fires.
Okay.
All right? Now there's an option in your camera to sync with the rear curtain. Now there's some advantage, some creative use that can be done of the rear sync of the flash curtain. So let's say you're doing a long exposure shot and the flash is going to fire at the end of the shot. So what happens, you are shooting and you have placed a model or some object in front which is completely in the dark. So it is not being recorded, only the far off areas where there's some light available is being recorded as the camera is recording the image. And when the flash fires, that object in the front which was in the dark so far will be recorded. So this is very good way to record motion in the surroundings but freeze the subject at one particular point that you want to freeze the subject, because when the flash fires, the subject will be frozen. Now your flash works at 1/800th of a second. So flash is very good way to freeze an object. If it's completely dark, your flash can freeze your subject quite well, because it is as good as 1/800th second of the time. So flash fires only for 1/800th second. So it's as good as using a shutter speed of 1/800th second in terms of freezing the subject's motion. I've seen some creative use when some photographers have shot dancers with dancing and the flowing fabric in the surroundings. And then when the flash fires at the end of the sequence, at the end of the exposure, then what happens? There's movement captured, and then the subject is frozen, like really quite well frozen in motion. So action is captured very well. All the features of the person are sharp and the image is sharp, but also in the background there's motion that you can see. That's very good creative use of it. After this, the last topic of today's session is bracketing. Bracketing is
one of the examples of this is in case of a dancing sequence wherein there is this hand movement. So when you freeze the photo, there is this the dancer who is clear, but you can also see the hand movement, which is kind of blurred.
Yes,
that's the one talking.
Exactly. That's one way to use that method. The next thing is bracketing. Bracketing is So bracketing is basically taking multiple pictures with different settings.
Yes.
So what you do, you take. So it is used for making HDR images. What HDR is? HDR stands for high dynamic range. Most of the times, your camera is not capable of capturing all the tonal range in one image. So what you do, you take 3 images. One you shoot for shadows, one you shoot for midtones, and one you shoot for highlights. So you shoot 3 different pictures, and then you merge them in the post-processing in a software, and then what you get with an image that has all the tonal range that was available in the scene. So this technique is used by landscape photographers or somebody who wants to shoot some antique object in the settings, in the natural setting, or maybe in artificial setting, but where there's a range of tonal values present and it's not possible in natural lighting to get all the tones in one single image. So then you shoot multiple images at different exposure settings, and then you combine them into one image. Now, one thing to remember when we are using HDR is not to use a shutter priority mode, because if you are shooting in shutter priority mode, how will camera try to adjust the exposure? It will change the aperture. Your camera will change the exposure by changing the aperture. And what happens when you change the aperture? Depth of field varies, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So when your camera is trying to take pictures at 3 different exposures, it is doing that by changing the aperture of the camera. In this attempt, it's also varying the depth of field, but you don't want depth of field to vary. You want all the pictures to have same amount of depth of field because you want to merge them into one picture later on. So you need to shoot either in manual mode or shoot in aperture priority mode so that you fix the aperture. That's one thing to remember. That's the end of the session today. And if any of you have any questions, please, you may go ahead and ask.
I'll just check if anyone has asked anything. I don't think so. Probably it was a bit on a heavier side. So uh, I guess people need to go back and practice stuff a bit. There's a very strong concepts that actually make a lot of difference in your photography style and understanding the exposure triangle also to maximize the use of exposure triangle, to maximize the output when you use on a specific priority mode. If you're using shutter priority mode or aperture priority mode, any of the priority modes, kind of understand it. It would make your life easier if you don't want to go to complete manual mode. So yeah, just go and practice this stuff. Change the modes and change the settings. Keep rest of the settings same and change one specific setting to multiple points and see the outcome. A lot of things that you can do with it to understand. Next session, I guess we are covering cameras.
How to buy a camera.
Yeah, that is going to be interesting. For all the people who are planning to purchase a camera, um, this session is for you. Um, what to consider before you invest in your first camera, or probably you have an existing camera but you want to upgrade it. So there would be useful tips for that, and I'm sure this is going to save you money and get you the right equipment that is going to suit your particular photography style, because camera would change as per your photography style. What's the purpose that you want to solve? So looking forward to the next session, Ashish.
Yeah, me too.
The next session is on Monday, 5 o'clock. Same handles,
All right.
same place.
Thank you guys
See
for
you,
joining. It was
everyone.
really fun.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks, everyone, for joining
Thank
in.
you.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye, guys.